Everyone. I just want to remind the students to please log into your Turning Point and check into your class. So class of 2028 will say class of 2028. Class of 2027, you are very used to checking into your Turning Point, so please check into your CRR class. But class of 2028, please go to your Turning Point and log your attendance for tonight. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to get started. Let's get the show on the road. My name is Dr. Margaret Tando. I'm the Associate Dean for Diversity, Equity, Inclusion. And I would like to welcome all of you here in person and online this evening. Thank you for joining us for our annual Vito Imbasciani, PhD, MD 85, and George DiSalvo LGBTQ equity, health equity lecture. This lectureship was established in 2014. The Imbasciani DiSalvo LGBTQ health equity lecture is dedicated to exploring timely and important healthcare issues and prevention services that impact LGBTQ populations to medical students and the broader College of Medicine community. The Imbasciani DiSalvo lecture was the first lectureship of its kind at any medical school in the US. Unfortunately, our speaker, Dr. Candrian, is not able to be here in person, but we are very glad that she's able to give her talk via the magic of Zoom from her home state of Colorado, and we look forward to hearing her remarks. Before we get started, there are a few housekeeping items I need to go over with you all. For those viewing online, we have a live captioning link. Is available in the chat. The lecture is also CMIE accredited this year, and the evaluation and the link to claim that credit is will also be in the chat. Lastly, there are no financial relationships from the speakers or reviewers that needs to be disclosed at this time. Now, I would like to introduce our incredible Dean of the Larner College of Medicine, Dr. Rick Page.
Thank you so much, Dean Tando. My name is Rick Page. For those in Zoom world, if we haven't met, I've met everybody in this room. It's so good to see the classes of 2027 and 2028 together. Really enjoyed getting to teach EKGs with the class of 2027 and 2028. Can't wait for a year from now. This is a special day. It's a day I look forward to every year. And believe it or not, this is the 11th annual Vito Imbasciani, George DiSalvo LGBTQ Health Equity Lecture. The title today is Improving the Way LGBTQ People Are Cared For Throughout Life. What more important topic could we have? I really want to express my gratitude to Dr. Imbasciani and his husband, George DiSalvo, who joins on some occasions. And George, I don't know whether you're listening in, but we miss you. I'm really delighted that Vito is here today in person and is here to join us. So we spend this evening deepening our knowledge and understanding of the medical care and preventive services that are specific to the LGBTQ populations. We appreciate the support that George and Vito have given our college and the many important voices we've been able to bring to our community thanks to their enduring generosity. As was mentioned, we believe this is the first and perhaps only lecture dedicated to this topic in the United States, and we're really proud to further the goals of healthcare by shining a light on the specific needs of the populations that are highlighted. This lecture is also consistent with our professionalism statement, where we emphasize treating everyone with cultural humility, kindness, and respect. We recognize that to fully commit to promoting equity and supporting our community, this makes sense for our community to provide a better, diverse, and inclusive society. Now it's my privilege to introduce Dr. Vito Imbasciani. He's the former secretary of the California Department of Veterans Affairs, where he served from 2015 until very recently this year. On top of this, in March of last year, he was sworn in as the chair of the California Institute for Regenerative Medicine. This is the state's stem cell research institute. The budget for this is, it's mind-blowing, $8.5 billion. California made this commitment to stem cell research back when other states weren't allowing it. And this remains a leader in the country and world, really, in terms of stem cell research. Dr. Imbasciani joined the U.S. Army Medical Corps in 1986 as a surgeon and served for 27 years, retiring as a colonel. He was Director of Government Relations for the Southern California Permanente Medical Group from 2004 to 2015, where he was a urologic surgeon. He served as state surgeon for the California Army National Guard and as surgeon for the U.S. Medical Corps. He's a proud alumnus of our college and receiving his MD here at the College of Medicine, the University of Vermont. He also received a Doctor in Philosophy and Master of Arts degrees in musicology from Cornell University after getting his undergraduate degree at the State University of New York in Fredonia, and of all things, as a piano major. He's truly a Renaissance man, a generous friend, an advocate of this university, an advocate for healthcare rights for those who are otherwise marginalized. And we're really fortunate to have Dr. Vito Imbasciani joining us today. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Imbasciani.
Looking at the future, this is wonderful. Yeah, Rick, I'm a Renaissance man because I was born in the Renaissance. I'm 78 years old. Don't you dare, any one of you, think of retiring. Okay, because this place is going to change your life. I really delight slipping a little note into the white coats of, I don't know, one person a year gets it, saying that everything that I've been able to do in this life, I've been able to do because the faculty at this institution put 2 letters after my name. UVM made me a physician. Yale made me a good surgeon. The United States Army made me a great combat surgeon. So it's been a delight to give back to the nation that's been very good to my immigrant family in all these very, very many ways. 26 of those 27 years in uniform spent under Don't Ask, Don't Tell. I tell people I've been to 100 countries, 5 of them with a gun, deployed to combat zones. You mentioned this was the 11th. Oh my God, right. It's just really amazing to me. I think my whole life has been, and I'm not going to go on for very long, I promise you, that if at any point in my life since I reached adulthood, which in New York was 18, old enough to drink, I did go to Woodstock. You didn't know that, right? It was close to home. I walked, right? After that, I don't remember, but if at any point in my life you had asked me to predict where I would be 7 years in the future, I would have absolutely been wrong every single time, right? I love music. I went to school, was a piano major, thought about becoming a doctor, but I looked around at all the pre-med students and did not like a one of them because many of them were choosing medicine in order to stay out of the Army or the Marines so they wouldn't go to Vietnam. Not the most altruistic reason to consider medicine. Persisted with that through my master's and PhD in musicology at Cornell. Got a Fulbright grant to Rome, Italy. It was actually the Italian government, but the Fulbright was to work in the basement of the Vatican archives. I'm really, really good reading a Greek and Latin 11th century manuscripts, if that should ever come in handy. But wound up teaching music down the road at Middlebury College, and my squash partner was a wonderful internist who many years later died of metastatic prostate cancer, which is ironic considering I'm a urologic surgeon. But during one game, he said, whatever happened to that dream of medicine? So I took a drive up and met the absolute most wonderful woman, the dean of admissions here, recently passed away at an exalted age, who looked at me and said, we've been in the business of training doctors for 160 years or something at that point. We've had a lot of PhDs in bio this and bio that, but never in the humanities. And she looked at me and said, but you're interesting. We'll take a chance on you. And I did have the pleasure of visiting her shortly before she passed away to thank her for taking a chance. So finished my residency at Yale, in the midst of which I was born at West Point, very military family going all the way back to World War I. And 5 days after my residency ended, January 1st of 1991, I was in King Abdulaziz Hospital in Dhahran, Saudi Arabia, taking care of sick, wounded, and sometimes dying American soldiers, mostly men. Subsequent wars have expanded that to men and women in American uniforms. A wonderful opportunity. When I came back and joined the Permanente Medical Group in California, met my husband, who was the CFO for Kaiser. I'm a Permanente doctor. Kaiser Permanente is actually two entities that are legally connected. And I ran for the California State Senate. I wanted to be the first physician in the Senate to head up the California Department of Health, or the Health Committee of the Senate. 8 Democrats ran in my district, which included Hollywood, where I live, Beverly Hills, and all the beach communities. It's the most highly educated district in California by PhDs and MAs, most highly affluent, the whitest district in California, and of course, maybe paradoxically, the capital of the anti-vax movement. Go figure. I didn't make the top 2, so I wasn't on the November ballot, but Governor Brown said, who is this guy down there in LA? Conducted himself as a gentleman during the election and asked me to join his cabinet as Secretary of Veterans Affairs, which I did for 8 years under him and Gavin. And 2 years ago, Gavin my boss gave me the perfect job for somebody who should by all rights be retired to head as chairman of the board the only agency in the world created by the voters, not by government. When George W. Bush in 2004 told the federal government, thou shalt not touch a human embryo, California said, sorry, Italian, right? You all know what that means. We will do it our way. And they gave this agency $3 billion worth of bond authority. And then in 2020 renewed it again with another 5.5 billion, which I spend along with my board. We have 200 people around the world who leaders and experts in every aspect of genetic therapy, CRISPR, CAR T cell, cell and gene therapy, to conquer every single one of the diseases that are amenable to this therapy. You know, there are 10,000 monogenetic diseases. Sickle cell just got approved for cures in February of this year. My job is to figure out where do we come up with the $2.5 million per kid. We have 7,500 children in California with sickle cell. But all those other diseases that one gene mutated and caused it. So cystic fibrosis, Duchenne's muscular dystrophy, Tay-Sachs disease. I mean, the list goes on and on. They are all on our radar screen. And I'm not in contradistinction to pharma. Pharma survives by making sure you take 2 pills a day for the rest of your life based on how many chronic diseases. The promise of regenerative medicine is to cure permanently. We've already got cures for kids that are born with disorders of immunity, inborn. Kids that are born in bubbles with no immune system. So we've got a cure in a clinic at UCLA to get these kids. We take their blood, tinker with their gene, put it back in after we multiply it in one of the factories that we've built. And 3 days later, if the child is okay, they out of the bubble, go home, lead a happy life. So it's a wonderful thing for a physician in the late stage of his career. You know, I used to joke that medicine is by and large a retail business. And if I'm not being too indelicate, I would tell people, I save the world one prostate at a time, right? You see one patient at a time. And then if you're lucky, you get involved in organized medicine, and then you can start to affect the health of populations. And then this job came along, which offers the possibility of affecting the health, well-being, and lives of people throughout the entire world. So I am in an absolutely great place. So are you, because I sat there once, graduated class of 1985, right? So I started in 1981, way before you guys were born. So, but it starts here. And when you graduate and you get those 2 letters after your name, when somebody opens a door, walk through it. You never know what's going to happen. Thank you, Dean, for your gracious introduction. Nice to be here, guys, right, gals.
Thank you so much, Vito. Now I would like to introduce Dr. Pam Gibson, who's one of the advisors for the GSA Affinity Group, to introduce our speaker. She's also one of the co-chairs of the Imbasciani Speaker Selection Committee.
Thank you. Good afternoon, and thank you, Dean Page and Associate Dean Tandau and Dr. Imbasciani. I want to welcome all the first and second year medical students and everyone who's joining us on Zoom, faculty, staff, and guests. Today I have the honor of introducing our keynote speaker, Dr. Carey Candrian. Dr. Candrian is an associate professor in the Division of General Internal Medicine at the University of Colorado Medical School and a Cambium Health Foundation scholar. She's on the board of directors of GLMA, a group of health professionals advancing LGBTQ equity. She received her master's in organizational communication and her PhD in health communication from the University of Colorado. She completed a postdoctoral training in health literacy from the Institute of Communication and Health at the University of Lugano in Switzerland. Dr. Candrian's research examines how communication affects outcomes in healthcare, specifically how it impacts older LGBTQ individuals and those who care for them. She spent much of her career navigating how healthcare suffers when patients aren't able to be open with medical professionals about who they are and what matters most to them. She's a community-based researcher working to create more inclusive assisted living communities. She's been an advocate for routine collection of sexual orientation and gender identity data in hospice. And ultimately, her goal is to affect change in communication systems and at the policy level, so older LGBTQ individuals receive the support that they and their loved ones want when they need it most. Her work's been funded by the National Institute of Aging, the Cambria Health Foundation, the Colorado Health Foundation, the Colorado Trust, the Next 50 Initiative, and the Lesbian Health Fund. She's appeared on Colorado Public Radio, NPR Here and Now, PBS NewsHour, Brief and Spectacular, as well as the AMA Medical Advances. For her work in advancing healthcare equity for LGBTQ older adults. So welcome, Dr. Candrian.
Thank you, Dr. Gibson. Can you hear me okay?
We
Yeah.
can-
Okay, great. And thank you all for being here, both online and in person. Dr. Imbasciani, thank you for making all this possible. And to Tiffany, Olive, and team, my deepest apologies for not being with you all in person, but my sincere thanks for doing a lot of extra work to make it still possible to join remotely. I'm thrilled to be here. As you know from that bio, my work focuses on serious illness, especially for older LGBTQ people. I'm a social scientist by training with a background in communication at an academic medical campus. And I usually get questions around how I ended up working in this specific area. And it all started in graduate school when I was doing an ethnography around death and dying, which is a really deep dive for understanding how culture impacts how people experience things like death and dying. So I spent 3 years shadowing inside an emergency department and volunteering at a local hospice. Obviously, a lot of what I was observing was clinical, but there was a prominent undercurrent that was not clinical. How well patients and their loved ones understood what was going on, how empowered or disempowered they felt about their ability to speak up and talk about what they wanted and didn't want. As a social scientist and researcher, what really struck me was so much of what was affecting patients was non-clinical. It was communication. The way people were talking and listening was directly affecting the type of care they were receiving. The thing is, what we all know in this room, dealing with serious illness is hard. It's hard for everyone. But what I kept seeing is that it's so much harder for people who are older and LGBTQ. These are people who have been historically stigmatized for most of their life. They've had to learn to keep silent, to stay safe, and silent has become a critical defense strategy that even exists in healthcare. I knew as a clinician I wouldn't be able to change prognosis or treatment plans, but where I could make a difference was in communication, the way people were talking and listening, and it turned out that could have significant impacts in their health outcomes, particularly for people who have been historically stigmatized, like the LGBTQ community. So that's what I do and why I continue to do this work. So why did I say serious illness is so much harder for LGBTQ people? It's harder because they're basically navigating this phase of life with 3 major disadvantages. First, financial. 1 out of 3 LGBT adults live at or below the poverty line. A third. A lot of this is directly related to the second reason. Many folks who are LGBT have a very thin network of support. They're 2 to 3 times less likely to be married and 3 to 4 times less likely to have kids, which means they're aging with a really thin network of support, which means less help with care, advocacy, things we know that make a big difference when you're facing something like serious illness. And third, and really underlying and amplifying all of this, is this lifetime of stigma and discrimination, which from the research we have, has concrete health effects. LGBT people are disproportionately at risk for a number of health issues. They have higher rates of anxiety and depression, substance abuse, cardiovascular disease, cancer, and suicide. How does stigma and discrimination have such an impact on this community? Let me give you some context. When I talk about older LGBTQ people, I'm talking about people who grew up in the 40s, the 50s, and the 60s, like Shirley, who didn't come out until she was 81. People who grew up when being LGBT was completely taboo. It was illegal in most states. People lost their jobs, their homes, their friends, their families, like Anne did. As some of you know, up until 1973, the American Psychiatric Association listed homosexuality as a mental illness. And it wasn't until 1990 that the World Health Organization removed their classification. Just imagine growing up thinking that there is something that wrong with you, that you are sick because you are LGBTQ, how vulnerable you would be, and how much you would internalize this stigma. This is the culture that so many people, especially those who are older, grew up in, and it radically affects communication. And even though the laws have changed, the APA changed, the stigma has stayed, and it affects the way LGBT people move through the world, what they share and what they don't. For much of my career, I really wanted to understand how specifically communication was contributing to health outcomes and what we could do about it. The thing is, in research, we deal with numbers all the time, but numbers can only take us so far. They don't tell us the stories, what happened and why. I've wanted to dig deeper. So over the last several years, I've interviewed more than 150 LGBTQ older adults. One of them was Pam. Pam's a lesbian in her 70s, and a lot of what she told me was how growing up in the 50s, not only was it dangerous, she didn't even have the words to describe herself. In this next clip, I'm going to play from her. She's talking about the 1961 film called The Children's Hour, which was really radical at the time. Here she is.
It's Lillian Hellman, and in short, there's two young women who are running a girls' school, and it turns out that one is a lesbian and one isn't, and the one who is killed herself. So it's not a happy story, but for me it was fabulous to find out that that category of person existed. So I would say from 8th grade on, I kind of knew it, but the vocabulary, gay and owning dyke and all of that, didn't happen until basically after Stonewall. Stonewall happened when I was a senior in college, and so the vocabulary to describe myself came out in the 70s.
To give you a sense of just how pervasive the stigma was, here's Pam again.
It was the summer I was 21, about to go into my senior year of college. And up until then, it was incredibly dangerous to even think you were gay, but...
So is it any surprise that so many people who were older in LGBTQ, who grew up in this culture, have honed what I call this habit of silence about this core part of themselves? And they've honed it for decades. Silence was and still is a critical defense strategy that exists in all aspects of our lives. But importantly, for us here tonight, it also exists in healthcare. 48% of LGBT adults say their own doctors and those who care for them don't know they're LGBTQ because they're afraid if they tell them, their care will get worse. And they're not crazy for worrying. In 2021, according to the American Heart Association, 56% of LGBT adults reported experiencing some type of discrimination from their healthcare team. For those who are trans or gender nonconforming, it jumped to 70%. This kind of discrimination is happening all over the healthcare ecosystem, including hospice. In a 2020 survey of over 850 respondents, 45% of the staff directly reported observing discriminatory behavior towards LGBTQ patients. Things like rolling eyes when patients were holding hands, not including the partner in major decisions, and even disregarding patient wishes. Unfortunately, this type of discrimination is still happening. Just a few months ago, 2024, according to the Kaiser Family Foundation, they interviewed over 6,000 LGBTQ respondents and found that 65% of them reported experiencing some type of discrimination in their everyday lives. And this type of discrimination that they found is having concrete effects both on physical health and mental health. In terms of physical health, 24% of respondents said that they experienced that reported negative healthcare experiences. 39% said that these negative experiences made them less likely to seek care. 6 out of 10 of LGBTQ respondents said that they prepare for insults and worry about what they wear and how they talk in order to be careful so that they can receive the care that they need. In terms of the impact on mental health, From this survey, 68% of respondents describe their mental health as fair or poor. 46% reported that they couldn't get the mental health services that they needed. And to put this all into perspective from the Kaiser Family Foundation, LGBTQ people were 2 times more likely to not have received the mental health care services that they needed. This is a lot of extra work and stress to worry about when you're entering something like the healthcare system. And this stress and stigma is real, and it's affecting people who are LGBTQ people in all aspects of their lives. So a shocking number of people who are LGBTQ, especially those who are older, don't come out. Just imagine hiding something so central for so many years. This stress from hiding takes a serious toll. According to Harvard Medical Magazine, in 2020, the stress can take up to 12 years off their lives. About 3 years ago, I met this woman. Her name is Esther. When I met her, she'd recently lost her wife, Kathy, to cancer. The thing was, when hospital staff realized they were a couple, Kathy's care got worse. So they felt like they had to hide their relationship through it all, through Kathy's diagnosis, her illness and treatment, and ultimately her death. I remember when I asked Esther what the hardest part of the whole thing was, and she said, "My wife was dying, and I couldn't even say we were married." Since they were hiding their relationship, Esther couldn't be in the room. She couldn't talk with the care team about next steps. She couldn't advocate for her wife on any level. She couldn't even hold her wife's hand. Then, when Kathy died, nothing. No one said a word to Esther because she was just a good friend, the emergency contact, not a grieving spouse who just lost the love of her life. Esther and Kathy were together 33 years. What Esther and Kathy's story reveals is how communication affected the outcomes of 2 people. Kathy didn't have the support or the advocacy she needed from the person she loved when she needed it the most, because Esther was shut out as non-family. Meanwhile, Esther got no grief support. She was just the good friend, not the grieving spouse who just lost the love of her life. And it turned out that Esther was so traumatized by the whole experience that she avoided a growth on the side of her neck for well over a year. So we have delayed medical care on the caregiver as well. Unfortunately, Esther and Kathy's story is not unique. This is a choice LGBTQ people face all the time. Do I come out and risk being treated badly, risk not having my partner in the room? Or do I stay silent and hide a fundamental part of who I am? That's a heck of a choice, and it's a wicked communication problem. On the one hand, we have documented discrimination and disparities in outcomes. On the other, we have people who are understandably worried about sharing this information and who have honed this habit of silence for so long. Compounding the problem is a healthcare system that doesn't routinely ask about sexual orientation and gender identity. It's like an official don't ask, don't tell policy. We don't ask because it's currently not built into a lot of our routine intake questions, our admission conversations, so it can feel uncomfortable for both the asker and the teller. If you think about it, in healthcare, in medicine, we unintentionally limit how people share critical information, which means we often get incomplete data. Unfortunately, this will continue unless we start making it really clear that it's safe to share and we start asking. So what can we do to make people feel safe to talk about this information? At the larger level, legislation is critical, giving protections to people that are long overdue. But it's really hard to legislate the way people think and feel, particularly about the LGBTQ community. At the individual level, one thing we can do is change the way we communicate, the way we talk, and the way we listen to each other. And one big way of doing that is what I call breaking the scripts. A lot of the way we interact in medicine is very scripted. The forms, the intake conversations, the patient interviews, the consults, and now sometimes even dictated by drop-down menus in the EMRs. We don't think about it, but they tend to be very formulaic. Are you male or female? Single? Married? Divorced? Widowed? Who's your family contact? I know these questions might seem pretty straightforward, but they're actually very limiting, and they're loaded with assumptions that aren't always spoken, but they're definitely heard. For example, the question, are you married? How do you answer if you're not legally married, but you have a partner? You either have to out yourself or not mention your partner, like Esther and Kathy. But we need to break these scripts and open them up in a way that gives people space to answer in a way that fits them and their lives. Because just by opening up some of these conversations and scripts, we're saying we're open to you. And importantly, we take the burden off the patient so they don't have to be the ones to come out over and over to a battery of new people when they're facing something like serious illness, when they are scared, tired, and exhausted. Go back for a second and think about how we get to know patients. Those forms, the intake questions, advanced care planning conversations, they're all critical tools in medicine because they tell us who a patient is, what they want, what they don't want. But if a patient can't say these things, or their caregiver, because they don't feel safe, it's very hard to have these things. But think about what we really need to know here. We don't really care if someone's legally married. What we really care about is the who. Who do they want in the room when we're talking about diagnosis, treatment, and planning? Who will be caring for the patient at home? Who do they trust to make healthcare decisions if they can't? So what if instead of asking, are you married, we started asking, who's the biggest support in your life? Just think how different the outcome could have been for Esther and Kathy. Another script we use a lot is around the family meeting. But like marriage, the word family can have a lot of boundaries that can box people in and box people out pretty quickly. Countless LGBT people have been cut off by their family. So if you say the word family, they might not share their real information or their real situation. And you may not find out what you really need to know, which is the who. So instead of asking directly about family, what if we started asking, who needs to be in the room when we talk about your care? Who's going to need support so they can support you? Who do you consider family? Who are your people? I want to give you another example of how these scripts are really what are basically our conversational habits can make it really hard for some people when they're telling you what and hopefully who matters. This is Janelle, a woman in her 70s, who transitioned in her 60s. In one of my conversations with Janelle, she was telling me about some of her biggest fears if she were to enroll in hospice, for example, or even her fears around aging. You'll have to listen carefully, and hopefully the audio is okay, but you can hear the fear in her voice. Here she is.
As far as palliative care, yeah, I do have concerns. I'm worried that certain things will be outside my control at that point. And I
What do you mean, like?
Oh, like I still have to shave, for example. I don't have hair on my face.
When she gets quiet, Janelle says, I still have to shave. I don't want to have hair on my face when I die. Here she is again.
I will be perfectly honest that one of the things that I thought about a lot before I transitioned was I don't want to die this way. I want to be buried as a woman. I don't want to be buried as a man. I don't want a man's name.
When she gets quiet again, she says, I don't want to be buried as a man. I don't want to die with a man's name. Think about one of the last conversations that you were part of or overheard. Where in those questions would there have been space for someone like Janelle to disclose some of her biggest fears if she were to get sick and enter hospice? These stories I've been sharing are not unique. One of the things that often gets lost when we talk about the LGBTQ community is our common humanity. In medicine and healthcare, we work with people, individual people, ordinary people who are trying to live their lives. These are our neighbors, our friends, our families. The problem is when we start to talk about groups of people, we often get into generalizations. And when there are generalizations, there can be a lot of fear. Fear of the unknown, the unfamiliar, and the uncomfortable. And this shows up not only in our personal communication, but also in our organizational level communication as well. But it's really important with the LGBTQ community to not only be welcoming as individuals, but also as a team in an office and an institution. So these are some things to do. I'll give you specific examples. But thinking about just small, sort of subtle things that you can do to begin to show that you are safe and you are open. And it sounds like Vermont is already doing a lot of these. Pronouns, these, I imagine some of you are using them. If you're not, they can feel really uncomfortable at the beginning. But pronouns are really critical. They send a message to everyone in the LGBTQ community that, hey, you're safe. And even more, they're critical for people who are trans and gender nonconforming, because they make sure that you have the information that you need and also show the dignity you have for the person you're caring for. Signs and symbols, I'll show some examples of these, but these can seem like they really don't matter, but signs and symbols are significant for people in the LGBTQ community. We look for them wherever we go, no matter how small or how subtle. They carry a significant message that, hey, you're safe, you can be open with me, and you can trust me. Website, I love learning from Dean Page about the professionalism and the cultural humility. These things are really critical, both for patients and staff and just an overall retention around culture. Forms I've talked about, policies and training. So what these actually look like in practice, I'm going to give you some examples. These are pins that we have at the University of Colorado with our pronouns, lanyards, and signs that all look familiar. The point with all these, and I don't want to spend too much time, is to really underscore how critical these are for the LGBTQ community, especially now where it is still dangerous to be LGBTQ, no matter where you live and where you're seeking care. These signs and symbols go a really long way. About a year ago, I received a small grant to make a documentary, which is called Just Us, the Longing and Hope of LGBTQ People. And the goal of the film was to really help people understand the disparities LGBTQ people face and why communication matters so much. So I want to show a brief, just 3-minute clip from the film, because it helps highlight how communication and breaking these scripts can really make a difference in the way LGBT people are cared for. Here it is.
My name is Jean Kuttner, and I am the Chief Medical Officer at UC Health, University of Colorado Hospital, and I'm a Professor of Medicine at the University of Colorado School of Medicine on the Anschutz Medical Campus. I've been doing this role for about 8.5 years. It is really bringing the voice of the providers, the physicians. We have trainees working with their advanced practice providers, bringing that voice to the executive suite. When I care for patients, I think it's really important to get to know who they are as people. That is probably one of the most important things I do, is who are they as a person, what's important to them, who is their support structure, who and what do they define as family, how do they want to be referred to, who is that person? And then I can then work with that person around whatever those health challenges are that come their way.
I am going to have to rely on professional support and services. I'm going to have to rely on someone to give me my testosterone once a week. I'm going to have to make sure that if something were to happen to me, that I have paperwork that makes sure that my spouse is going to be the one to be there, because we weren't legally married at that point. And if something were to have happened, they would have called my parents, who were not part of my life.
When you're dealing with serious illness, and especially if you belong to the LGBTQI+ community, there's a lot of fear, and the stigma that has been experienced over a period of time can become much more magnified. And because you are at your most vulnerable point in your life.
I can just see the toll on people of not being able to share who they are, I think, and who they love. I think there's multiple consequences. I mean, somebody who has a serious illness is already often struggling and often has distress, and it's not just the physical distress, it's sort of existential, psychosocial distress. And if you're not able to be your authentic self and to share who you are, and it just adds to that distress in incredibly burdensome ways from a very practical standpoint too, in terms of who is allowed to stay with people, who do we turn to for decision making. If we don't know who is important to somebody, and as a spouse or as a partner or as a loved one, then we may make some terribly wrong assumptions and be not including the right people.
For up until now, I've been focused a lot on the individual level, but before I close and get to hopefully your questions, I want to zoom out and really talk about the impact that this habit of silence is happening on more of a macro level, because it's impacting because it also is impacting research. Basically, what's happened is we don't have complete and accurate data about the LGBTQ community because we don't consistently, as I said earlier, ask questions about sexual orientation and gender identity, or SOGI data. The result is, in the vast majority of medical literature and research, LGBTQ people have been invisible. At the population level, LGBTQ people have been absent, which means our research is incomplete. And when you're dealing with incomplete data, it's really hard to analyze disparities and outcomes, and really hard to develop targeted interventions that could really make a difference in how LGBT people are cared for. So we need to start and consistently asking these questions about sexual orientation and gender identity, and we need to do it in a way that people feel safe. And I realize if you're not used to asking these questions, it can feel really awkward at first. But the more we start asking these questions, the more we build them into our forms, our intake conversations, the more routine they'll hopefully start to feel and sound, just like other demographic questions we've been asking. So how exactly do we do this? And I'd love to hear how in the Q&A, if you all are doing this and what it looks like. I'm just going to share a few examples that we're using in Colorado and that were tested by the census and NASEM. For gender identity, they recommend 2 questions. What sex were you assigned at birth? What is your gender identity? For sexual orientation, it's 1 question that they recommend. Which of the following best represents how you think of yourself? These questions are really critical for beginning to not only let LGBT people feel like they can be themselves, but also allowing us to have full information to care for someone. So I hope if there's anything you remember from this talk, it's this, and it's really about this habit of silence that has existed for decades, and that how deeply it affects the way LGBT people communicate, what they share and what they don't. And with that said, it's really important that we start being proactive at every level, at every interaction. So I want to leave you thinking about, when you start to ask questions next, really think about what information you really need to know. Does the way you frame your question give space for lots of different types of answers? Imagine if you were trans and had to answer it. Or if your family had rejected you. Or if you were the same-sex partner, but not actually married. Does your question shut them out? Or does it invite them in? Does it say, hey, I'm okay with who you are and who you love. You're safe here. All the LGBTQ people I've met in my research, they're not asking for a lot. They just want to be able to talk openly and be heard without prejudice. And all we have to do are break these scripts a little, show them we're safe, and listen. And thank you all for listening with me tonight. There you are. Oh.
Thank you very much, Dr. Candrian, for that talk. We'll now open it up for questions. Yes, we need a microphone so she can hear you. So Olive has it right there.
I think so. Oh, great.
Yeah.
Hi. Thank you so much for the talk. Really, really appreciate your time and the opportunity to learn from you and ask you this question, which is, you talked a bit about a scenario with Esther and Kathy in which by being out, the quality of Kathy's care was decreasing. And you also talked about sort of a universal intervention that collects demographic data, which would necessarily out people. And I'm curious about balancing these 2 realities, that we will benefit from having data that increases visibility of LGBTQ folks, and also that there are very present spaces in which it's deeply unsafe to be forced to be out as a queer person?
Yeah. I'm so glad you asked that question, and so glad I'm looking at the hope of the future. It is like the question, and I think it's gotten increasingly even more challenging to figure out how to do this. I and others I think are really struggling with this because on the one hand, exactly what you said, this information is really critical, not just from a patient level perspective, but really to begin to have data on the LGBTQ community. And knowing that it's still very dangerous and grounds to actually be discriminated against if you disclose this, which is not a solution or answer to your question. I think, though, what I have tried to do is to really begin to start educating people on what role this information really plays. That it's not knowing whether someone is gay or trans or bisexual, but that this information is a part of who someone is. And to fully care for someone, it's important to know all of this. And so I think the first part is really deep education on why these data really matter. And I think the second part is really focusing on having non-discrimination policies, but I don't think those are enough. I think really educating and having people start wearing the pins of safety to really begin to, if we're going to start collecting these data and really have it be done accurately and safely, we need to know the people who are collecting this information are safe. And so I don't think it's an easy solution. I don't think it's a one-level solution. I think it's a really complex problem that needs a really complex solution. So, and I think that actually is part of it. I think beginning to realize that we can't just add these data fields into the EMR and expect these data to be collected, and to really begin to talk about SOGI as a really public health emergency and complex problem, so we can begin to really think about complex solutions. If you have ideas, I'd love to hear them, or if you have solutions. But thank you for that question.
Thank you.
More questions? Yes.
Thank you. Just another question about the SOGI questionnaire. How often are you thinking of updating the information of this database, as I imagine that identities might change over time and how people conceive of themselves?
Another excellent question. I think that's part of also, I mean, there's been very little research done in this area. There's been some, just on when to ask these questions, how to ask these questions, how do people want to be asked? And I think that's another great piece of how often they should be updated. And I think it should be really driven by the community. So I don't have an answer because I don't know specifically, but I think it's I don't think it's a static thing like age we can leave alone. Erase that, knowing that there is fluidity to these, which I think adds another complexity, but an important piece that this isn't a fixed data point. So, you all are asking great questions. Thank you.
Yep.
Are you routinely collecting these data in Vermont?
Yes, we are. At the hospital. Yes. When you check in, you have the option, and it's actually now showing up on the patient's. If I bring up my patient's chart, yeah, that information is on there. Yes.
Great.
Hello. Hello. Thank you again for your talk. I was just wondering if your research had considered any intersectional approaches to how we look at LGBTQ care in the medical field, in looking at how, someone's race, ethnicity, their culture, religion, and their socioeconomic status might affect the kind of care they're getting as an LGBTQ person.
Yes. And that's, I think a lot of times, especially around disability and race, that usually those are actually the identity that they receive more discrimination because they're the more visible identities. But I think it's really important, which I did not mention, but that to know that LGBTQ is not a monolithic group, and that that it's really critical to think about how these other intersecting identities disproportionately affect them and disproportionately put them at risk for even greater disparities. I think even some of the statistics from Kaiser Family Foundation that it's always 2 to 3 times worse for those who are Black, for example. And disability is actually a really critical piece to all this, given that LGBTQ people do have higher rates of disabilities. So really beginning to think about how that plays out, especially in healthcare setting.
Hello, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciated it, and kind of just learning how we can approach our patient interactions better is always a really worthwhile use of our time and studies. So thank you so much for being here. I was just wondering, I know that in addition to kind of using it to make decisions regarding end of life care and other kind of decisions about big medical interventions, sometimes demographic information is also used on the like insurance and billing side. And sometimes if things don't match, then providers have difficulty being compensated for their work. And, you know, if you have a person within the queer community who maybe feels very comfortable with their doctor, or health professionals, but hasn't had their name yet legally changed, or kind of those other barriers that stand in their way, then things may not match and providers may run up against problems with that. And then that can also become another barrier for the patient. And so I was just wondering if you were aware, or if you have any pointers on how we can kind of change things on the insurance side, or maybe not. I won't ask you to solve health insurance. That's too much. But if you just have any ideas about how we can make changes kind of not just within the patient interaction, but kind of on a larger policy and bureaucratic level, so that we can kind of be serving our patients best in all aspects of their care.
Oh, this future is very hopeful. I have not worked on the insurance side. I think I've just started a health and aging policy fellowship in DC this year, and I think it is, I'll have a better answer in maybe 6 months. But I think it's a really great point, because I think part of it at least is beginning to see how the infrastructure is really set up to continue to make it really difficult for LGBTQ people to get the care and the rights and the benefits that they need. I'm happy to look into it more. I have not worked though on the insurance side, so it's an excellent question, and thank you for giving me something to do tonight. I'm also reading the chat too, or the Q&A. There's
Okay. Any other questions? Oh. Oh. Are you reading them, Dr. Candrian?
Yeah, sorry, I don't think I'm like reading. I'm not reading about insurance yet. Yeah, I'm reading I'm reading them. Dr. S. Laxon and Dr. Burns. Let's see, particularly given the conversations. Do you want me to read it out loud?
We can read it. We can read it out.
I can read the question out.
Just the question
here. Okay, so this first one is from Dr. Aslickson. What an amazing talk, Carey. Thank you so much for the eloquence by which you tell these stories, particularly given the ongoing political and public conversations that may be increasingly anti-LGBTQ. What macro level approaches might you recommend to better advocate for more and equal rights and medical care for LGBTQIA individuals and communities? And what do you perchance see as first steps or first wins that we might choose to prioritize?
Thank you, Rebecca. I think it's easy to immediately go for like the larger, like pass the Equality Act, which is a bill that keeps getting introduced and failed that would really give federal protections to LGBTQ people across the country, which would not allow people to discriminate on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. But I think particularly for an immediate win and some smaller wins that I think can have significant impact is really thinking about allyship. I think a lot of what can really begin to shift with how the LGBTQ community is cared for can't be done by just LGBTQ people, which we know, but really having allies speak up and stand up and really wear those signs and symbols to be really supportive allies, I think is one critical thing that can be a win and can do a lot of good for the LGBTQ community. I think advocating for non-discrimination policies around SOGI is really critical, and I think the education with SOGI is also a really critical piece as well. And I think what Dr. Imbasciani and his husband have done of really creating spaces to have these conversations and really, especially with medical students, is a huge win to begin to start thinking about these things very early on. Because I think as you change 2 people, you can change a few more, who then change a few more. And I think those are the wins we need right now, particularly with the current climate.
And let's see, there's one other question. Thanks so much for the talk. This is from Dr. Stephen Burns. Thanks so much for the talk this evening. I was wondering about the experiences of LGBTQ boomers who had to deal with being silent for so long versus the experiences of millennials and Gen Z. What do you see as potentially the future opportunities and challenges in caring for the next generations of LGBTQ elder adults?
I love that question. I think one thing that with these talks and why I really focus on this habit of silence is just so that younger generations really realize how scary it was. Not that it's still not scary, but really the culture that so many of these folks grew up in and how it has stayed with them. And I think also it's very easy, particularly for older generations. I mean, many of them were married, they had kids. And so starting to not make quick assumptions and really thinking about how we can ask questions in a way that really gives people the space to answer, I think is really critical, because I think sometimes there's a disconnect with realizing just how bad it was and how hard it was versus how much of vocabulary the millennials and Gen Z have had and how much more visible so much of this has been. But to really realize how hard it was and how much extra work needs to be done on an interactional level for people to feel safe. So I think that's one of the greatest challenges.
Any other questions in here? Yes.
Hi, and thanks so much. I just have a quick question, I guess. What advice do you have for trans and other LGBT people who are going to be physicians and going to be kind of like, in the fight, so to speak, about like maintaining your own mental health? Because I imagine even for you, like it's a lot, like it's a pretty dark subject if you're really digging into numbers and stuff like that. So what's some advice that you have?
Thanks for that question. I think community is a lifeline. I think community is a protective factor for so many of these risk factors. And I think finding allies, finding people early on is really critical. And for me, that has looked like I spend a lot of time in the community, and I think that it really helps, because I think even in Colorado, what felt like being the only out lesbian at the entire academic campus, it still is very hard to find people internally, but I think finding people in the community is really critical. And I'm happy to help you find others too, of I think other groups. I mean, GLAMA is a big group, the health professionals advancing health equity, but I think those spaces you can really meet great people as well, because I think it's a similar feeling that we all feel doing this work, being part of the community. And I think particularly now of what's happening, it's exacerbated for for the trans community. So I think having at least, I think the support is really critical, and to think that you can't do this alone, and to not try to do it alone, because it wears you down in really destructive ways. And so I'm happy to be a support for you. And I think just connecting with other people to make sure they have your back and you have their back, is probably the best advice I can give. And I also find writing to be very cathartic through all this too. So the community, but just making sure you're also finding ways to express it or make sense of it, or release it. I think that's also critical too, whatever works for you.
Question over here. Oh, Liz is coming.
Thanks so much for taking your time and talking with us today. I was thinking more specifically about some of the examples you were talking about with people's partners not being able to be in that room and supporting them if they didn't feel comfortable sharing about their relationship. And was curious if you had thoughts or advice if a patient shares that they have this long-term partner, that's the person they want to be with them, and they share that with one provider, but then maybe they don't feel as comfortable with other providers or specialists that they don't know as well. And kind of walking that line as the person who might know that, between wanting to respect their privacy and their safety, while also wanting to be that advocate to say, this person is their partner that deserves to be in that space to support them.
That's excellent. And I think what you just said, the best things I've seen happen is to talk with the patient. And what you just said, I want to respect your wishes, your privacy. And I also want to make sure you're getting the best care you need, and you have the people you need in the room to support you. So either offering how you might be able to help them feel more comfortable, or just letting them tell you how they'd like to handle it. If they really just want, I don't know if it's just you to know this, I think that's important, but I think just asking them specifically, how do you want me to handle this? Because one, I care about you deeply, because I don't want to violate the privacy, but I also want to make sure you have the care, and engaging them in the process, I think can be really beneficial. But it's a tricky line for sure that you're navigating. So I think as much as it can be driven by them, the better.
Any other questions? Yes, right there, Liz.
Hi. Okay. I am going to try to articulate this well, but I think that collecting the SOGI data is a great first step, and it's really important for all healthcare spaces to be implementing that. But how do you bridge the gap? Or, I mean, how would you suggest educating providers on not only being respectful and open to offering the collection of that data, but actually implementing that language into the way that they're providing care for a patient, and not misgendering transgender and gender nonconforming patients, so that they're truly getting the best and most, I guess, humanitarian care from their provider, and aren't just a statistic on a piece of paper.
Yeah. I'm glad you asked that, and I think that's is important around SOGI, that doesn't just become these data points and numbers. And I think that's I'm going to get to the trans piece, but I think the ideas around breaking the script, I think are really helpful as even a first step too, because I think that really helps people open up in ways that sometimes the way questions are being asked don't allow for. And I still think that those questions are anyone can answer, whether you're straight or not. Those questions really just give space for anyone to be able to answer. Do you still have the microphone? Can you clear? The trans comment was around how not just a number, but really around pronouns and education?
Yeah, okay. So I think my main thing is that I've noticed that there are a lot of healthcare providers that are open to talking to their patients, or I guess hearing about what their sexual orientation is or what gender they identify with, but then they don't really know how to implement that language of the patient's pronouns into their care and their everyday. So how do we not only educate physicians and current and future, that it's not only important to collect that data, but also to actually act on that and implement that into the way that they're providing care and communicating with other people, whether it's their patients or anyone.
Great. I think the practice, because I think a lot of these, what I talked, like they're conversational, we need to develop these new habits. And so I think in using each other, I mean, it feels just from the limited time I've spent with all of you, but it's a culture rooted in your professionalism, the cultural humility of really being okay with correcting even your other students or other colleagues to say, hey, actually they use she, her pronouns. And I think just the practicing saying these things, if you're not used to it, it's I get it. I mean, we started it, but the more you do it, the more natural they feel and the more habitual they become. So I think the more we can start doing this as individuals and teams and organizations, I think the better we all will be with developing these habits and also be more in tune to that these matter, and it's not okay to misgender someone, and it really is a threat to their dignity. So I think also creating a culture where to have these conversations around, if someone is not used to asking these questions, really feeling safe to say, can you tell me how you ask for pronouns? Can you tell me how you share yours? Of really creating a culture of learning too, I think is also really important. But I think that the habitualness of these is a really critical piece. So they start feeling and sounding natural.
Yeah, I'll just add a little to that.
Great.
Last year's Imbasciani lecture, after the lecture, I was challenged to, when they presented, they talked about, when you go to introduce yourself to your patient, you offer your pronouns. And that's how and that's what I've been doing actually for the last year. So when listening to you, I go, I'm Dr. Tanda, I'm going to be I'm your trauma doctor. I use she, her pronouns. And then the responses I've gotten back has just been all over the place. It's been wild, but but it's practice though. But now it's way easier for me to do it, because when I first started doing it, I felt really like I didn't feel right. But now every patient's room, when I go to them, and this is my first time meeting them, I always try to say that. I think so. I agree. I think it's practice that we have to do it. And just listening to you, Dr. Candrian, today, I was like, I love the script of who's your biggest support? Who do I need to be talking to when you go home? Who's going to be helping you? I think that's another script that I'm going to pick up and actually implement in my practice. So I mean, this is incredible. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing that.
Peter, did you? Yeah.
Hi, Dr. Candrian. I had a question about how do we balance patient population research where potentially people from the LGBTQIAI plus community may correlate with certain prevalence of diseases, with balancing that with also gender affirming care, where they're not feeling targeted if they're screened for certain things or at higher risk of certain diseases. I'm curious to hear your thoughts about that.
Thank you. I just want to make sure I'm answering it the right way. Can you repeat the beginning part?
Yeah, so I'm curious to hear your thoughts about how can we balance research where there's correlations about the prevalence in this target population of the LGBTQIA+ plus community with gender affirming care and their subjective experience in healthcare.
Great. So research about gender affirming care in the actual. Is that it?
And the certain prevalence or a correlation of diseases.
I don't know that I know that the. I don't 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 the disease is specific to trans community. I don't know. I mean, I think, and when I talked about the disparities, but I think I don't know enough, I don't think, to answer that effectively. I think that we're getting a lot of great data around gender affirming care, and I'm happy to share other resources that I think would be able to answer that better. And I apologize if I'm just tired and I'm not understanding it fully, but I don't also want to misspeak about this. But I think there's great research happening around this. I don't consider myself an expert in this area around it, so I don't want to give you information that's not complete.
For example, if there's a higher risk of HIV in this population, how do we balance that with the subjective experience of the patients in broaching these topics?
Does anyone in the room have a better answer? I bet you all do.
Yeah, question is too hard. We can't.
It is too hard. I think it's a great question. I think it's
Dr. Imbasciani.
yeah.
Hi, Carey.
Are you going to answer that?
Not on your life, right? But I do want to follow the gentleman's question on prevalence and gender affirming care. So I'm a urologic surgeon, and I'm going to ask a lot of your lecture today has been on the sensitivity of language. So I'm going to share with you the most difficult thing that I have in my practice of late, and that is, let's take the example of a transgendered male. I'm sorry, yeah, let's take a transgendered female who's in my office referred because that person still has a prostate. And so there are all of the screening things that are age appropriate that need to be considered. PSA screening for prostate cancer, perhaps even benign growth that causes urinary tract symptoms. But this is an organ and it's an anatomy sensitivity question. And I'm not really asking you the question, but rather just voicing a scenario. That's really difficult because that part of that person's anatomy is in denial or is other. Maybe that would be a better, and it wouldn't be any different than the transgendered male who needs to go to the OBGYN clinic for dysmenorrhea or for cervical screening, right? So any thoughts on that level? That's really tough because I'm okay with the pronouns and everything, but this is a whole other level of sensitivity.
It's really hard. It's hard. These are hard conversations, and I think that's with the SOGI data that it I think done in its best is really an opening to a better conversation to have around, what is important to know about you for me to take care of you. And I think when the trust is there and the rapport is there, that people can feel safe to tell you about what their body is like, what it looks like, what it doesn't look like. And I think there's a series of steps, I think, that are really critical for the LGBTQ community. Pronouns are not the end all be all. I think they're a critical step, just like SOGI. I think the signs and symbols. And I think that all of these are hopefully pathways to having conversations that can get at this type of complexity so that they feel like they have given you the information and you feel like you've got the full information to care for someone. It's hard. That's why I think there needs to be pathways to having these conversations more safely, more accurately, and more compassionately, and also with, I think, a strong sense of humility, recognizing that this is a whole new vocabulary for a lot of people. It's it's new, and so going into it with a lot of humility, I think, is also important. But I think when the safety and rapport is there, these conversations are a lot more manageable.
Well, thank you, Dr. Cambrian, very, very much for being our 11th Vito Imbasciani George DiSalvo LGBTQ health lecture. We really appreciate you being here.
Thank you all very
Though
much.
not in person, but definitely here and your wonderful talk. So I want to say thank you for that.
Thank you very much for having me. And I'll have to come another time to get maple syrup.
I also want to thank Vito and George for their ongoing support. I would like to thank the selection committee, our speaker selection committee, Dr. Gibson, and everyone else that helped with that, and also the office team, Olive, Emily, Tiffany. Thank you very much for making this possible. I think everybody have a great evening, and thank you for attending.